I don't think we can start talking about anything without touching on COVID. So if you look at COVID and the last 2 years, there's a report which says that 210 million people went below poverty line in just these 2 years of COVID. And before COVID, we were running at some 23-24% poverty. So that's about, another 280, 290 million people who are already in poverty. And as you know, the poverty line in India is a very, very harsh line. It's like really, really abject poverty. So if you add the numbers up, today we have something like 400, 500 million people below poverty line in our country. And that is actually much higher than the number of people who are below poverty when we got independence. 15 August 1947, the entire population was some 330 million. So today, arguably, even assuming all of them were in poverty, that means we have more people in poverty than we had, at that time. And this is during a time when, India has progressed phenomenally, in terms of so many ways, right? Whether it is literacy, whether it is GDP, whether it is per capita income. And that's a very sad reality we are living in, which is that there's so much progress that's been made, but that progress has not reached, 500 million people, more or less. And this is just pure poverty. Then you can take other challenges, whether it is mental illness, there's disability, there is old age, there is lots of other issues, women and children who are being, abused. There's so many other issues that we need to address. And the point that I'm trying to make is that these numbers are all really, really large. And how do these challenges get addressed? Hi, Swati. How do they get addressed? And they get addressed very simply by the forces of what I call Samaj, Sarkar and Bazaar coming together. I think civil society has a role to play, markets have a role to play, and state has a role to play. And one visualizes for this discussion these three being the pillars of society. The state has a role to play, the markets have a role to play, and civil society have a role to play. The existence of, a vibrant state, a vibrant marketplace, and a vibrant civil society. I think all three are important for a progressive society, for a progressive, flourishing society. It's only when all three work the way it should, in a balanced way. And these three play a role of, in some ways, of course, doing what they need to do with each other, and also keeping checks and balances on each other. The state keeps checks on the markets, the civil society keeps check on the, between each other, there's a sort of a nice balance that you need. Now, what's happened over the years is that civil society, which arguably before 1947 was the dominant pillar of society, because the entire freedom movement was a civil society movement, over the years has become weaker and weaker. The state has become very, very strong. The markets have become immensely strong. I don't know if you know this, but during COVID, we've added one new dollar billionaire every year. And most of them are actually in our city of Bangalore. So markets have done immensely well. Why is it that the state and markets have done so well? Why is that civil society has not done well? It's not that we lack a civil society. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of good work that happens in civil society. There are large numbers of organizations doing great work in the deepest corners of this country. But what's happening there? When you think about it, what is it that causes, how do you bring scale? How do you create scale? You create scale by bringing people together, bringing monies together, bringing processes together, technology, networks, etc., etc. And that for me is management. And I've been in the corporate world. I've not been in the government, but now I've been in the social sector for the last more than a decade. And that's what management is. How do you bring all this together to solve problems at scale? So if you look at businesses before management, before the Industrial Revolution, they were all, what you would call mom and pop shops. It's only when Industrial Revolution you started producing goods in large quantities. By the way, it's the Industrial Revolution engineers who created management, because they needed management to manage the goods, to manage working capital, to manage distribution, and so on and so forth. So that's where management sort of started. Now, if you look at the study of management, the discipline of management for public administration, which is for the state, or business management, which is for the markets, the first MBA program goes back to 1900. Between Harvard and Wharton, they'll fight this battle, but somewhere there in 1900 was the first MBA program. The first public administration program was Woodrow Wilson in 1880. So about 120 years of management for the business, about 140 years of management studies for is what it has taken. Even today, there isn't a single school of repute in the world that is talking of management for the social sector. And thereby what has happened is that we've tried to apply business management principles into the civil society. We've tried to apply public policy and public administration principles into the development sector. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't work. Because the way you manage the state, you cannot manage markets. Markets have very different dynamics from how the state is managed. The priorities of a state are very different from the priorities of the market's place. And just like you wouldn't manage markets like you would manage the state, or just like you wouldn't manage the state like you would manage the markets, the civil society requires a very different approach to management, because the fundamental objective functions are itself different. What you exist for is different. In fact, there's some people who are my friends in the civil society who will tell me, don't tell me the kind of management that caused the inequalities that you face today is the same management that will solve the inequalities that exist today. So obviously you need to rethink. Now, some people will argue, but it is about managing people, it is about managing... Yes, it is. Even in the state, it's about managing people, managing processes, etc. And in the markets, but the way you manage it is very different. And that's the key to think about how does this whole thing work. So I call this the management inequality. I think this management inequality underlies the larger inequality that we're trying to solve. And unless you create this management cadre, which is the cadre that tends to drive scale, you will end up with a civil society that remains very small. And I'll give you a data point, right? So if you take in India, the largest consumer goods company is Unilever. And Unilever today, every year, reaches 720 million Indians. The largest civil society organization, and there's no hard data on this, but if you ask me, is Care International or Care India, and they reach about 38 million people in the country. So if you think about it, what management in the world of business done is been able to take it to the scale, and that's India. If you take it to the Facebooks and Googles and everybody else, you're talking about 2 billion people, 3 billion people, and so on and so forth. Whereas the largest, if you think about it, right, if I ask the youngest of people in this group, name the 10 top businesses in this country, and they will rattle it off. You try and name 10 big, not-for-profits in this country, you will struggle to go beyond the third or the fourth name. Another interesting data point is that there are more businesses in this country whose 2%, so there's a CSR budget, you have to give 2% of your profits. That's revenues minus cost profits, 2% of that is higher than the total operating budgets of the NGOs in this country. That's the kind of indifference that one is beginning to see, and one needs to fix this. And unless you have, it's a very different method. I'm not for a moment recommending we need to create large organizations, but we must have large organizations that have large impact. We must have organizations that reach not just 38 million, but 380 million and 2 billion people if you really want to drive social change. And this is where the whole management side of things sort of, kicks into my sort of pitch or my proposition to all of you. The fundamental objective functions that you're trying to maximize is very different. In the world of business, you could argue you're maximizing shareholder value, or you're maximizing revenues, or you're maximizing profit or valuation or whatever it is. In the social sector, you're maximizing social good. It's almost very often non-monetizable. And unfortunately, we live in a very capital-dominated or capitalism-dominated world, and everything gets measured in money. One of the reasons I believe gender inequality exists is because we don't value the work women do. You don't put a value because it is not worth valuing in a very management sense. In management accounting sense, there's no economic value of my mother who took care of our entire family for 40 years. She didn't contribute to the GDP at all. It was my father who probably earned some, whatever little money that he earned, counted in the GDP. So even how you imagine these things have to change, otherwise you will never change society. So these fundamental axioms have to change, otherwise it's never going to impact society. So we've been working at ISDM on, trying to figure out this challenge of how do you bring management to the social sector. And how do you do it? Which is relevant for the social sector. So we don't just take an MBA and plonk it here and say, that's how you run it. And I'll give you a simple example, right? Let's say managing people. The reason a person will join a corporate sector or stay in a corporate sector or get motivated in a corporate sector is very different from why a person will stay in the social sector or be motivated in the social sector. So how do you design reward structures? What does rewards even mean? Are all very, very different. In my days in banking, we used to have things like golden handcuffs. I can't even imagine golden handcuffs as a concept in a social sector. Because handcuffs itself sounds like a horrible, but you will realize that a lot of the language we use in the world of business is very, very pushy, it's very coercive, and thereby drives a lot of inequality also. And I have nothing against business. I think the business management works in the world of business. But we must recognize that the exact same thing can actually be dangerous here. The other thing is that business management originated in the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the fundamental principles of business management was around standardization. Industrial Revolution was built on standardization. So everything was about how do you standardize. So today, if you think about it, the schooling system in our country is a great example of how you apply an Industrial Revolution principle to manage a humanitarian process of preparing a generation for the future. So what do? You create a shop floor. That's what you've done in schools, right? You put children on the first class, and then after 1 year, you move them to the second, you move them to the third, and you reject a few in between if they don't qualify for that. That's not how human beings grow. Some children will learn in the seventh year. Some people will learn in the fifth year. Some people will learn maths earlier. Some people will learn reading earlier. Some people will learn singing earlier. Some people will learn dancing earlier. It's very different. But when you standardize, and that's not how human beings work. So we have to figure out what are the axioms that will drive management in the social sector. And that's the journey we've sort of started at ISDM. ISDM is the Indian School of Development Management. Swati is an alum of, that's why I got excited when I saw her here. She works in Bangalore. So if you look at not-for-profit management, there are not-for-profit management schools in the world. And we've gone around the world, across US, Europe, Asia. You'll find that every school of not-for-profit management either sits in a business school or sits in a school of public policy. And it's fundamentally flawed because then the DNA that you bring to that subject is a business management principle. So the business schools are saying, how do we apply business management to solve social sector problems? Public schools are saying, how do we apply public policy and public administration ideas? And both of them fail. You can learn from them. There's no doubt about it. Just like public administration can learn from the world of business, business can learn from the world of public administration. I think the social sector and what I call development management can learn from both too. But it has to be thought through very differently. So this is where we've been working, and I'll just give you some examples of how these things are different, right? So some of the fundamental differences, just to give you an idea, just a flavor, because this is a short talk, between, let's say, business management and development management. Development management being management for the social sector. In business management, from the first day I left IIM Ahmedabad and started working, I was competing. I was competing for customers, I was competing for market share, I was competing for share of wallet, whatever. And it was a market share, which means it was at the expense of someone else. If I got a market share increase, that's a share, so somebody's share has to go down. In the social sector, it cannot be about competition. You and I can't be competing to offer some children better education because that's resources being wasted. We should be collaborating to work to get that child a better education. So how do you change the entire management practices around the principle of collaboration? So then how do you create the culture in an organization? What does marketing mean in the social sector organization versus everything starts changing. So this idea of collaboration versus competition at a very fundamental level changes everything. If I take another idea, so in the world of business, the idea of a unique selling proposition is very big. I know to make an iPod and nobody else knows, so I'm going to sell that in millions, I'm going to charge a high price. Forget that. A sweetened drink like Coca-Cola, that's a secret nobody else knows, so I can sell that globally, and I can whatever. In the social sector, it cannot be about USP. It has to be about something all of the community knows. Because if social change has to happen, it should not depend on me as an NGO to be living there and doing this day in and day out, a year in and year out. It has to be an open secret. It has to be something that everybody knows, and that's when the not-for-profit organization will succeed, because that's when the society will sort of progress and change. So fundamentally different. So then the moment you do that, then how do you design your sort of, all these things that I talked about? What is your technology? What does a patent mean? What does copyrights mean? How do you share information, or do you keep it in, confidentially? How do you reward people for creating, sort of these sort of practices and so on? So, and I can go on. I mean, if I take another one, let's say, for example, I have something called a core competency in business. So I can do something my customer cannot do, or would prefer not to do, and rather pay me to do that work. And that's why the business sort of survives. Whereas in our kind of work, we want the community to be able to do the work themselves, because only when they eventually own the work, they'll be able to continue doing. So how you approach this management is very different from a business where I will keep it as a core competency, and I don't want that ability to go away from myself, and so on and so forth. So this is really where it starts completely differing. So we started work in this place, and our hope is that we'll build this whole domain. And this domain now requires actually building the knowledge itself. There isn't a textbook you will find on not-for-profit management that is not written by a business school. You will find papers, but those are largely business schools have written these papers. And we need to figure that out. We need to build a cadre of talent, which goes on to bring in what I call professional management to the social sector. And professional sometimes get confused as, oh no, why are you saying professional? That's very business. No, unfortunately, it's got hijacked by the business. Whereas professional is really bringing a science and a method and a system to how you do, a code of ethics to how do you work. So how do you build a profession of development management is really where we're working. And that's the work that really ISDM has been trying to do over the years. And where we are trying to take this forward is to work on ideas, individuals, and institutions. You need the knowledge, you need the talent, and eventually you need institutions that offer it. And if you ask me, what does success mean for a school like Indian School of Development Management, is if you're able to create an ecosystem for management of the social sector, which means like MBA today is a very popular and commonly understood program. How do you make development management mainstream? How do you have masters in development management as a common degree? How do you have development management schools like there are IIMs and so on and so forth? And how do you have regulations that then talk about all these things? And then organizations are eventually hiring students, hiring this cadre of people who are professionals in management for the social sector. So that's really where we are, and we've started our work. And if I can take 2 minutes to talk about the work that ISDM is doing, is we said that the way to drive this change has a few sort of key principles on which we have to do this. And essentially what we're saying is we need to build an iconic aspirational institution. And if you look at this country, before National Law School came, those of you who remember those times, law was not an aspirational profession. National Law School came in Bangalore, set up a 5-year integrated program, built a beautiful campus, and today it's one of the top 3 choices of youngsters. Law in this country has not changed. There are still average of 10 years for a court to resolve a case, all sorts of the wrong thing. But law is very aspirational. So institutions have that ability. And it's not just law. If you take National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, they inspired a whole series of schools in this country in the whole design space. Fashion technology. Why would a country like India have fashion technology as one of the leading schools? It is because it inspires. I mean, people like me, I'll be honest, if I went to an IIT, it was not because of a passion for engineering. It was a cool thing to do. If I could crack IIT, I would go to IIT. So we need to build an institution that's iconic, that's aspirational for people to want to come and study there. The second aspect of the work that we believe is very important is working on the whole ecosystem. So there are some schools that offer management, like rural management school and things like that. But nobody is working on the whole ecosystem. And we're fortunate to have some really great minds of the country working with ISDM who said that it's not enough if you produce a program. You need to produce the knowledge, you need to produce the books, you need to produce the faculty, you need to go work with the organizations, you need to work with the CEOs to get them ready for these students who come in and so on and so forth. So you have to work the whole ecosystem. And the third part of that work thereby is you can't do this yourself. You do this through what we call collective wisdom and collective philanthropy. Nor do we have the money. Nor, you need a lot of people to come together, a lot of institutions to come together, a lot of individuals to come together to build this whole space of development management. And the third part of that whole thing is really um, how do you do this and make it like I mean, how do you? It's there's a marketing challenge. You have to make society get excited about this. That's when it'll all start beginning to happen. And how do you bring? You can't solve the problem just in your country, because development management needs to become accepted widely. So how do you build those collaborations globally? So it's about how do you bring development management not just in India but across the world. And in about 10, 20 years, if you're able to make that happen, I think that the billions of dollars we spend year on year on year will have a multiplier effect in terms of bringing people out of poverty and so many social evils from the margins and so on and so forth. And that's a huge multiplier effect. And, I think this where I started off, the inequality of having somewhere around 500 million people in this country living in poverty, in the margins, being abused, that we need to significantly reduce. And this incremental game that we are right now going through is now going to make that difference. So our belief is you build this cadre of management, you build the knowledge of how do you lead and manage organization. Then in the future, instead of a Unilever type organization that reaches 700 million people, we'll be talking about social purpose organizations that is impacting more than 700, if not, a billion people in the country and in the world. So that's broadly. I don't know if I went too fast, but I hope I gave you a sense of what is development management, why it is important, and how we think we can build that whole space. Would love to hear, from all of you. What do you feel? What are your thoughts? What are your suggestions? What are your comments? Or if you want to be involved, because our view is that we bring social capital is required to make this happen, intellectual capital is required to make this happen, and economic capital is required to make it. So we're permanently in the process of collaborating. It's what we talk about, right? How do you build these social purpose organizations through collaboration? So we want to do the same. So that's really the story that I wanted to be heard. Thank you. Yeah. No, in terms of to close this talk and the chat that we've had, I really think there is a crying need for management in the social sector, and management that understands society, that understands the complex nature of social change, and is able to drive change at population scale. We need to see organizations in the social sector having impact at population scale. And only then the millions and billions of people who are in the margins, in poverty, will get a hope of partaking in probably the most phenomenal progress that humankind has ever seen. So really, development management is something that I believe is a huge lever for change. It's only going to happen when all of us are part of that. My request to all of you who are listening to this is bring your social capital, bring your intellectual capital, bring your economic capital. We need all of it to make this happen. Thank you so much to BIC for this opportunity. Really appreciate that.